This is Ed at HCAM with the second show that has no name, but HCAM insists on calling Ed Talks. And you may remember, if you saw the previous show, it was a hot topic. We talked about firefighting in Hopkinton over a span of 50 years with Chief Gary Doherty and firefighter Bill Hamilton. Well, today we have a special guest, and we're going to go to the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of temperature. And some of you may know that paper burns at approximately 451 degrees Fahrenheit. And there was a book by that name, Fahrenheit 451. Well, today we're going to talk about temperatures approaching minus 452 with our special guest, our cryogenic wizard. If you think about the Who and the pinball wizard, well, we've got the cryogenic wizard here today, well known in Hopkinton, Ken Weismantel. Hi, Ken.
Hey, Ed.
Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
This should be a hoot. Ken and I, our careers almost overlapped in the same company that was going through severe financial distress circa 1980. The company started.
81.
Well,
81.
Well, circa 1980, okay. 81.
Okay.
And the company started out as a spin-off from Arthur D. Little with government research projects to develop a cryogenic refrigerator. It's kind of like your home refrigerator, had two stages at different temperatures, and a helium liquefier. And Ken started at the helium liquefier operation, which was known as Helix Process Systems, in what year?
81, February 1st, 81.
In 81, and I started at CTI Cryogenics. I don't remember the month, but it would have been in the summer of 1984. And from that, that covers the intro. So basically, I think Ken and I can just kind of talk about, what we did and what we saw. I want to talk a little bit about cryopumps and how they work. And it's something that I still do. In fact, next week, I am going to be talking about cryopumps out at Lawrence Livermore National Labs, believe it or not. I still don't believe it, but people still call me on the phone and say, Ed, can you do this? So that's what I'm doing, as opposed to going to town meeting. I'm going to miss that. So cryopump works like your car windshield on a cool day when dew accumulates on it or frost accumulates on it, and it creates a vacuum by a purely natural phenomenon. But helium liquefiers are more involved. And Ken, can you kind of talk a little bit about how a helium liquefier works and your time at
Sure.
Helix and then Koch Process Systems?
Sure. A helium liquefier is kind of like your home refrigeration or your heat pump. You basically have a compressor. You compress a fluid, and then you expand it. And when it expands it, you take the work out of it, and that makes the gas colder. And a helium liquefier does it in three major stages. There's actually two levels of expansion, and you take the cold gas and make the incoming gas, the other one colder, and a bunch of heat exchangers.
So and that's a regenerative heat exchanger,
and
correct?
Then it's a counterflow heat exchanger, yeah. And then at the end of the day, you would then put through a Joule-Thomson valve, which does the final expansion and gets it down to temperatures 4 degrees above absolute zero, minus 452-ish, where you can get it done. So all refrigeration is kind of that way.
So the Joule-Thomson valve is basically an orifice?
Yeah, and you can also control it too. But basically, yeah, it takes high pressure, makes it low pressure. And
it comes in as a gas?
It comes in as a gas, and shortly after that, there will be some portion of it will liquefy, and the rest of the gas will be recycled up the counterflow heat exchanger to make the warm stuff colder, and you take all the energy out of the system. And I got hired in at Helix Process Systems to manage their standard products group, which made helium liquefiers for most universities, and we also had a bunch of special projects. And then I worked on many, many big liquefiers in my life. I did the world's largest one. I did the manufacturing of that for Brookhaven. I did a proposal for the compressors for that. worked on getting the logistics of getting these 50-ton pieces down to Long Island from Westboro, where we were located. The standard product, we do 15 units, most of which are kind of the same, but not exactly the same, and then one or two special ones for some special project a year. I did probably several hundred helium liquefiers in my 17-year career. I did over 50 Stirling cycle Phillips cryogenerators for liquefying oxygen and nitrogen gas and argon. I did one LNG small facility for Los Alamos National Labs.
LNG is liquefied natural gas.
Right, and methane. And then, let's see, what else did I do in my career? I worked on the Fermilab ring, did all the expanders on the ring refrigerators for that, which is a big atom smasher right outside of Chicago. Worked for every national lab.
So Ken was a builder and a maker, where no surprise, I was a talker. And predominantly I traveled around talking about cryopumps, using cryopumps, taking care of cryopumps, how they worked, troubleshooting cryopumps, etc. And the liquefier, and Ken can correct me if I'm wrong, the liquefier is almost a step added to what's called a Gifford-McMahon cycle, which came out of Arthur D. Little, as opposed to the Collins cycle liquefier. And the Gifford-McMahon cycle provided two operating temperatures at roughly minus 320 degrees Fahrenheit, or liquid nitrogen temperatures, and then minus about 440 or so, which is getting into the point of condensing hydrogen, argon, gases that it will not freeze. So a cryopump works by freezing air gases, oxygen, nitrogen, etc., and those molecules would freeze to cold panels in the cryopump, which I have and can show. But gases like hydrogen, helium, and neon remain still mobile at those temperatures, and activated charcoal was used. Activated charcoal is commonly used as all kinds of filter stuff, but cooling it to cryogenic temperatures, it would suffice to entrance hydrogen molecules into the pores of the charcoal, where they would get lost and couldn't find their way out. This was done, as Ken talked about, in multiple stages, using a heat exchanger that cooled the gas coming in, and then when the gas was expanded to leave the refrigerator, the gas took the heat away from the heat exchanger, thusly cooling the heat exchanger, and then stepping down, getting colder and colder. The original applications for this device was cooling things like radio telescope parametric amplifiers. And you want to be able to discriminate out of the noise of the amplifier an incredibly weak signal. And by cooling the amplifier, and you can all try this at home with your 100-watt stereo, just turn the amplifier up with nothing else, and you will hear noise. And so by cooling the amplifier, it got rid of the noise, which is caused by things like electrons bouncing into things in the wires and stuff, so to make it sort of superconducting. So that was sort of the beginning of the Gifford-McMahon cycle. Then about 1970, about the time of the pinball wizard, a salesman for CTI, name was Bill Lonnie, one of his other contacts was at Polaroid, which in 1970 was a very hot company. And Polaroid was complaining because in the vacuum technology of the time was a thing called the diffusion pump. And diffusion pumps kind of work like a coffee percolator, and they would sometimes emit their fluids, typically in that case oil, up into the process where Polaroid was maybe trying to coat lenses. I really don't know what they were doing. And they wanted to get rid of the trap that was between the diffusion pump and the process, which was filled with liquid nitrogen. And so Bill Lonnie had this idea And also IBM was involved in this, which this is before my time, so my knowledge here is a little shaky, and came to CTI, for whom he was a sales rep, and said, you got this really cool refrigerator. What could we do here? And that was the beginning of the use of cryogenic refrigerators as a vacuum pump, and went on to do huge work in semiconductor production predominantly, where you want to have very, very clean processes and no contaminants, notably oxygen, getting in the way, or water vapor. What Ken was doing was to make liquid helium, and the liquid helium would be used to...
Well, the MRI use, superconducting magnets, accelerators, lots of good things. I mean, part of the early Gifford McMahon, though, was a contract from IBM where they wanted a cool chip. If you take a computer chip and you make it, instead of running at room temperature and run it down at say, liquid nitrogen temperatures, it runs twice as fast. And the problem is, after they, Arthur D. Little invested a lot to make the cycle for this, for IBM, they said, oh, by the way, our computer chip is going to cost half of what it is next year. Is your cooling system going to cost half of next? And of course, that didn't happen. I had a similar situation in I think it was right when the stock market crashed, '87. I was out at a conference with an IBM guy, and I sold him to do a Stirling cycle cooler for the same purpose. At that time, I was providing cooling systems for ETA Systems, which was a supercomputer. Unfortunately, it only was supercomputer with the second place, as opposed to Cray, that was the first place supercomputer, and they folded, but not before I sold them 25 liquid nitrogen cooling systems, which was a very fun project. But so IBM, having seen us at this conference, said, well, you know, we'd like to invest in a Stirling cycle thing with all sorts of mag levitation on it, so that it wouldn't have any maintenance, like, you know, your computer. And then they came back the following year after they had invested $1 million or so, and Digital invested another $1 million in the same project. And they said, oh, by the way, is it going to cost a little bit less next year because the cost of our computer chips continues to go down? And we said, no, we'll be lucky if we keep it going with the rate of inflation, because mechanical stuff doesn't
get cheaper.
Doesn't get cheaper unless you really mass produce it, and this is not going to be a lot.
Yeah.
You know, Ed, we've kind of talked all these nerdy engineering stuff. We ought to talk maybe about some of our personal experiences and remembrances of people we worked with and people we met.
I'm getting there.
You're getting there?
Yeah.
Okay, because I don't want to get too nerdy with everyone on cryogenics, but I mean, it was a big part of my career for 17 years,
Yeah.
and
Well,
I certainly enjoyed it.
So I was thinking we had probably 50 years between us, so it's more like we got 40 years between us.
Probably, yeah.
Because I started out in cryogenics with metal bellows, with a development project for the AIM-9 Sidewinder missile, where you have a cryogenic cooler in the missile to cool the infrared detector. When I started at CTI, the company had basically, it was a three-leg business. One was semiconductors, one was what we euphemistically called junk coaters, which would be jewelry and optics and stuff, and the third was military. And in my time there, at various times, various legs were what really carried the company. At one point, it was the military that carried the company. But over time, the company's focus became more and more on semiconductor. And when the semiconductor market crashed in 2001, 2002, it created havoc within the company. My favorite story involves a person who grew up in Turkey. And Turkey paid for his education all the way through a PhD from MIT in vibration analysis. And after that investment, Turkey did not say, you got to come home. So he went off to work for CTI Cryogenics. And one of the big users of our equipment was Intel. And Intel had a sputter process. A sputter process is where you're putting down aluminum on a wafer, and that aluminum becomes the wiring for the wafer. And this what we call tools had, I don't remember, 5 or 6 cryopumps on it. And the wafer would be moved from process to process to process to process through this tool, always under vacuum. And there was a vibration problem, and wafers would walk off the robotic arm. So this cost huge money. It was a huge disaster. And cryopumps ran at 72 RPM, so they had a displacer, not a piston, a displacer, similar to a piston but porous, has a heat exchanger in it. So that runs at 72 RPM, and they pointed to CTI and said, "You're the source of the vibration problem." We had this guy, I don't want to mention his name because I don't want to potentially embarrass him, but my joke is that he lived his entire life for this moment. Boarded a plane in Boston and flew out to Intel out in Oregon and went into the wafer lab and listened and felt and so forth, and said, "No," he said, "I want you to turn the cryopumps off." And a cryopump would maintain its operational temperature for a while. So the vacuum could be maintained in this tool for a while. And he said, "I want you to turn the cryopumps off, and then I want you to walk wafers through the process." So robotic arm picks up a wafer, puts it in a chamber, picks up another, blah, blah, blah. And lo and behold, there was a vibration. So at that point, Hal could have gone, "Not a cryopump problem, not my problem," and left. But Hal lived his entire life for this moment, and he spent 2 or 3 days at Intel looking at this machine and poking around to determine the cause of the vibration, which were tiny little needle bearings in the robotic arm, and replaced them with simple bushings, and the problem went away. So that's my favorite story from CTI. I got more.
Okay, well, I'll trade you one. After our division got sold from Helix, we were bought by the Koch brothers, the famous Koch brothers, and both Charles and David Koch came to the plant on closing day. And Charles Koch came up to me, and we're standing in front of all of our equipment, and he says, "Tell me about the equipment." And I go and give him all the details of how many liters an hour it's making and whatever, and who's using it and whatever. And he says, "What's the gross margin on this piece of equipment?" And I had to think a little bit, and then, yeah, I gave him a number. We go to the next piece of equipment, and I go through all the technical details, and he goes, "What's the gross margin of that piece of equipment?" And I'm thinking, when we went to the third piece of equipment, I started off my presentation with, "The gross margin on this equipment is," and so that was, but that day was also memorable. We had a petty cash fund of about $500 at the company, and David Koch, who at that time was worth $300 or $400 million, personally counted to make sure that all $584 of the petty cash fund was in the till that day when they bought the company and bought that asset. So I thought that was kind of funny. But many project reviews I'd be meeting with David Koch, and he was quite an interesting character.
I have only one Koch brothers story, and I do not know the validity of it. But the story was that representatives of Helix were on one side of the table and the Kochs were on the other side of the table, and they had a discussion and they came up with a number, and David Koch reached in his pocket, pulled out his checkbook and wrote a check and handed it across the table, which all of us could do for umpteen bazillion dollars, except that his didn't bounce. That's the story. I don't claim it to be a true story.
It probably was true. A couple months after we were in there, they had a company announcement that they had bought a refinery in Houston for $400 million in cash or something like that. So at the time, the Koch brothers were the second largest privately held company in the United States. So it was kind of an interesting.
Now, you had a really cool job in Hawaii.
Yes.
Now, everything we did was cool. You got to understand that. But this is a really cool job.
Well, one of my hobbies is hiking mountains. And I got assigned to build coating systems for
what we would have called a junk coater.
For telescope mirrors. And only these telescope mirrors, the primary mirror was 22 tons of glass and 8 meters in diameter. And so I had to haul pretty close, and I built 2 on the top of the Mauna Kea on the Big Island of Hawaii, and I built 1 in Chile. And I spent a year installing the 2 on the top of the mountain in Hawaii.
You didn't fabricate the chambers. You brought the chambers in pieces?
Well, some of the pieces were 20, 30 tons and 30 feet across, and we had to rebuild the bridges and put hinges on all the signs on the western side of Hawaii. It was like a 56-mile to get it from the port all the way up to the top of the mountain. 2-day trip. And it was special rigging equipment. It was just a fun project that took a lot, and having to work at altitude had its own challenges. I was able to work and think at altitude, but sometimes if you went walking up a 20-foot ladder, you might get to the top and you just forget why you were there. So everyone carried a notebook just so they could kind of remember, just because working at 60% of the atmosphere is
so
tough.
That's like 14,000 feet?
Yeah, just a little 13.8. And I had a lot of fun hiking and playing with the volcano on my off days, but it was a 6-day-a-week, 3-hour commute there and back to the top of the mountain every day. So 8 hours up to the top of the mountain, 3 hours of driving, and we did that for the better part of a year.
3 hours to go up and 3 hours to go down?
Yeah. No, hour and a half each way.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And we could have stayed at a place on the side of the mountain. And by the way, if you ever get to Hawaii, you ought to go look at the stars, because the stars are just outstanding from that area. If you go up anywhere near the top of the mountain, you can see the Milky Way and all the stars. You can actually see constellations and individuals. Clusters of stars, and particularly if you're working for an astronomer, they can point them all out to you. And so that was a fun year. I built telescopes with cryopumps because the vacuum coating was done, but these were big cryopumps, like 36, 42 inches in diameter. We took some of Helix's guts and made them bigger to fit in. And so anyway, mirrors, most of them are coated with aluminum, and we had to put 100 molecules thickness of aluminum uniformly on the surface of the glass.
Done on site? On
site.
And periodically it has to be recoated?
Sure. Once a year or so, aluminum corrodes enough, and as they lose reflectivity, and a telescope likes reflectivity, so then they would recoat it. Now, some of the sputtering processes today on telescope coating, you can put a clear coat over it and maybe do it coat with silver or gold if you're interested in more infrared type technology, and then you don't have to coat quite as much. But there gets dirt and dust and stuff like that on top of the mountain, and you got to clean them and maybe recoat. And it's interesting, and because of the large surface of an 8-meter diameter piece of glass, you got a lot of light collection, and so they would do Hubble type images from the surface of the Earth.
Yeah. One of the other things that CTI was involved in as a refrigerator were early generation MRI trailers that were trailered from site to site. And one of my favorite stories with that was one of the techs who had to go service one. And techs at the time wore steel-toed safety shoes. And we have a magnet of, huge magnetism. I don't know the number in Tesla, but it was big. And so Paul starts up the ladder to get to the top of this, and you know what happened. His feet, he couldn't pick them up because his shoes were stuck. He had to undo his laces and take his feet out of his shoes, and they resided there for a while. But the only other really humorous story I've got is probably too long for our remaining 2 minutes. And so on that note, Ken, I want to thank you.
Okay.
It's been really interesting. I hope that our audience, our fabulous audience, international audience, learns a lot from what we had to talk about. And who knows, maybe they'll call us back for a rerun of something else.
Who knows? I mean, but you know, it's a kind of a nerdy subject, but cryogenics was a big part of my life for a while, and obviously your life. And then we got to meet friends here in Hopkinton, so that was good.
We met through basically our daughters when they were probably in kindergarten, and they are still best of friends. My daughter living in Montana and his in Massachusetts. And it is, I can't speak for Ken, but speaking for myself and my wife, it is just really cool to see these relationships that continue, because life is about that. Life is about relationships. Thank you.